$500 million. Just let that number sink in. This wasn't a ruling, it was a declaration of war. You don't assign a $500 million fine unless the goal is obliteration, not restitution. This wasn't a matter of legal consequence. It was a scalpel meant to carve someone out of public life entirely. It wasn't about sending a message. It was the message. You could feel it in the courtroom, the tension, the weight, the unspoken understanding that this wasn't a regular judgment being passed down. This was a performance, a spectacle. The kind of move made not out of necessity, but out of symbolism. It was less about what had happened and more about what was feared. This wasn't about guilt or innocence, it was about control. The fine itself wasn't just staggering, it was surgical, precise in how devastating it was. The way it landed, the way the words were spoken, it had the air of finality. The tone said, "You're done." Not just penalized, not just reprimanded, erased. That kind of financial ruling isn't about justice. It's about destruction. And everyone in the room knew it. And the silence that followed, that said everything. No cheering, no gasps. Just that cold, sterile silence. The kind that wraps around your spine. Because even the spectators understood. What they were witnessing wasn't the end of a trial. It was the flex of a system, showing what happens when someone gets too loud, too bold, too close to the truth. It wasn't law. It was theater. And this was the closing scene where the protagonist gets crushed under the weight of a punishment designed not to correct behavior, but to eliminate the possibility of resistance. There's something uniquely chilling about a courtroom when it stops acting like a place of justice and starts becoming a tool for suppression. When the people handing down sentences look less like arbiters of fairness and more like gatekeepers of the narrative. That's what this felt like. This wasn't blind justice. The blindfold had been ripped off. This was a targeted strike from a system that felt threatened and needed to make an example. You could read it in the faces of the people present. Some were in shock, others stone-faced, pretending this was normal. But nothing about it was normal. $500 million? No one could. Justify that with a straight face, not without knowing deep down that the point wasn't fairness. It was fear. Not theirs. Ours. This was meant to make everyone watching ask themselves, what happens if I speak out? What happens if I challenge them? And that's the real verdict. Not what was written on paper, but the fear they hoped would echo into every heart paying attention. It's hard to describe the psychological power of a fine that size. It's not just financial, it's reputational, spiritual, existential. It tells the world this person has no value left, nothing to offer, nothing to recover. That's the sinister part. It's not about the money. It's about the message that someone's very presence, their ability to exist within the system, is being revoked. Their voice deleted, their future shredded, their identity smothered under the weight of a figure so large, so obscene, that it can't be argued with, only feared. But it was the way the ruling was delivered that struck the deepest nerve. Cold, clinical, detached, as if the judge wasn't speaking to a person but erasing a problem. That's the part people miss. These decisions aren't spontaneous, they're premeditated, thought through, calculated for maximum devastation. And in this case, it was effective. The room could feel the force of it like a sudden drop in pressure, like watching someone thrown off a cliff while being told it's just a warning. There was no balancing of scales, no careful consideration of consequences, just a gavel coming down like a guillotine. It was punitive, performative, and perfectly designed to send one message loud and clear. Step out of line, and this is what happens. Not because of justice, but because of what you represent, because of what your presence threatens to unravel. So, when that number was spoken aloud, 500 million, you could feel the real goal behind it. Not restitution, not even punishment. The goal was to erase the idea, the symbol, the influence, to remove someone so completely that even the ashes of their public persona would be blown away in silence. And that's what made it so haunting. Because everyone watching knew, it wasn't just about one person. It was about all of us. The room had gone ice cold after the sentence was delivered. No movement, no whisper, just the heavy silence that follows something seismic. Eyes darted toward the bench, expecting the usual signs of finality. A judge closing a file, gathering, papers moving on. But then something subtle, something almost imperceptible disrupted the script. A pause, a tremor, just enough to break the illusion of complete authority. It started with a slight hesitation in the voice, the kind of break that only the attentive would notice, barely a crack, like a strain under pressure. But once it started, it couldn't be disguised. The shift in tone wasn't legal, it was human. You could almost see it as much as hear it. The tight posture loosened, the firm gaze wavered, and that's when everyone realized this wasn't over. Not in the way anyone had anticipated. What happened next didn't make sense on paper. No transcript would capture it, but the emotion was undeniable. The judge, who moments ago had seemed invulnerable, even vengeful, now appeared to be cracking. Not just hesitating, breaking. The voice trembled again, this time unmistakably. Not from anger, from something else. Something far more uncomfortable. Remorse. It was jarring. A courtroom is supposed to be a space of stoicism, of hard lines, and firm judgments. But this was something different. The person behind the bench wasn't wearing the mask of authority anymore. The mask was slipping. For a few moments, the robe didn't matter. The title didn't matter. The lines rehearsed 1,000 times didn't matter. What was left was someone fighting emotions they weren't prepared to feel in front of a crowd. Eyes started to widen across the gallery. Murmurs rose, soft, uncertain, confused. No one expected to see emotion from that side of the room, least of all this kind. This wasn't righteous indignation or performative frustration. It was raw, uncontrolled, the kind of emotion that only bursts forth when the weight of what you've just done begins to settle on your chest. The kind that says, you may have followed the letter of the law, but something deep inside you knows it wasn't right. Tears didn't fall all at once. At first, just a blink that lasted too long. Then the eyes turned red. The kind of red that speaks to inner turmoil, to a storm brewing just beneath the surface. The face tried to remain composed, but the truth was winning. There was no hiding it now, not from the people in the courtroom, not from the staff seated nearby, not from the person staring back silently from the defense table. It was visible, palpable. This was a man unraveling under the very judgment he had just rendered. That's the irony of it. The ruling was supposed to be the end, the exclamation point, the last word, but it became something else. The sentence, once uttered with such finality, now echoed with doubt. You could see it. The judge didn't just question the reaction of the room, he was questioning himself, questioning whether the magnitude of the punishment served justice or served something else entirely. And it wasn't just doubt, it was pain. A pain that hadn't been there moments earlier, the kind of pain that doesn't come from opposition, but from conscience. Maybe it was something said in passing. Maybe it was something unspoken, just a look, a silence, a presence. But whatever it was, it triggered a reckoning. It unearthed something human, something real, something that wasn't part of the script. Now the people watching didn't see a symbol of the system. They saw a person, vulnerable, torn, trying desperately to hold on to dignity while being consumed by guilt. That image, of someone collapsing emotionally in the very space where they're supposed to be most composed, struck harder than the sentence itself, because it exposed the truth behind the curtain, that even those who seem untouchable can feel the weight of what they've done. And when the tears finally came, not loudly, not dramatically, but silently, steadily, it wasn't weakness. It was revelation, the kind of moment that strips away all pretense. For once, there was no power in that seat, just a soul, wrestling with the aftermath of a decision that would haunt him far. The silence in the courtroom had an eerie weight to it, the kind that doesn't come from shock alone, but from a strange, shared awareness that something deeper was unfolding, something unplanned, After the thunderous pronouncement of the judgment, no one expected a response. The kind of ruling that had just been delivered usually crushes the room into submission, strips the air of resistance, but not this time. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate, unshaken. There was no outburst, no desperation, just composure. As if he understood something no one else in that moment could grasp. He didn't look around the room for support. He didn't plead with the bench. He looked forward, calm, steady, grounded. And when he spoke, it was so quiet at first that the rustling of jackets and shifting of chairs had to stop before the words could be clearly heard. What he said didn't come across like a protest. It wasn't a defense in the traditional sense. It was more like holding a mirror up to the entire process that had just unfolded. The words didn't challenge the ruling outright, but they peeled back the layers around it. One by one, they exposed the real weight of what had just happened, not legally but morally. It was the kind of truth that doesn't scream. It just stands in the center of the room and refuses to move. That truth didn't accuse. It revealed. And that's what made it so powerful. With each sentence, you could feel the atmosphere shifting. Not wildly, not theatrically, just subtly enough to notice that people were no longer breathing the same air. Even the court officers, trained to remain impassive, glanced sideways with barely concealed curiosity. Something was happening that wasn't in the script. And then, it happened. The judge, whose face had been rigid, unreadable, utterly composed, blinked. Not just physically. Something inside him blinked too. His eyes lifted from the papers in front of him. He looked directly at the man standing before him, and it was like a wall cracked open. The shift was small, but it was real. His expression went from cold professionalism to something else, something unsettled. The words continued, quiet and firm, never rushed. And with each one, it became clearer. This wasn't just about the ruling. This was about conscience, about responsibility, about the weight of decisions that aren't just procedural but personal. Somehow, in that small exchange, the authority in the room began to change hands, not legally, but spiritually. The balance of control tilted, not through force, but through undeniable truth. And then the judge's posture changed. A small sigh escaped. His shoulders dropped ever so slightly. That was the first crack. Then his lips pressed together in a way that suggested internal conflict. A swallow, a brief flicker in the eyes, and finally, a shift in breathing. Unsteady, uneven. He wasn't reacting to a threat. He was reacting to something much harder, to ignore. The haunting realization that what had just been done may have crossed a line that the law couldn't define, but the soul could feel. The tension was no longer about the verdict. It was about the response to it, the quiet dignity of it, the refusal to meet injustice with vengeance, the choice to speak rather than shout, to reveal rather than resist. That's what did it. That's what landed harder than any accusation. The judge's eyes, now visibly moist, betrayed an inner struggle that no gavel could silence. No one in that room had ever seen it happen. A figure of absolute authority, visibly cracking. The tears didn't come all at once. Just a glisten at first, then a blink held too long, then a slow exhale that caught in the throat. The kind of moment that strips away all robes, titles, and pretenses. The kind of moment where you see not the official, but the man. A man facing the possibility that he hadn't just followed the rules, but helped bend them towards something wrong. It wasn't what was said that broke him. It was how it was said, with clarity, with principle, with a level of humanity that the system isn't built to handle. Because when you stand in the face of power and don't flinch, when you speak the kind of truth that needs no defense, it does something rare. It reaches even the hardest of hearts. And in this case, it was enough to bring one to the edge. The courtroom had all the makings of a dramatic finish, an overwhelming fine handed down, the press waiting just outside, and a room filled with people expecting finality. But what followed defied every prediction. In the wake of a decision That should have crushed the spirit of any ordinary individual. Something unexpected took its place. Resilience. A kind of strength not born from stubborn pride or rehearsed defiance, but from a deep internal clarity that couldn't be shaken by numbers or titles. He didn't sit frozen in disbelief. He didn't lash out or storm away. He stood tall, his demeanor unshaken, as if the moment had clarified something rather than destroyed it. And it wasn't just posture, it was presence. A quiet force that filled the room more completely than the judgment ever had. The gavel had struck, the punishment had been dealt, and yet there was no collapse, no surrender. Just the unmistakable energy of someone who had made peace with truth long before walking into that room. And that's what unsettled people the most. The ruling was supposed to be the climax, the knockout blow, but the real impact came afterward, in how he carried the weight of it without stumbling. There was no need for dramatic speeches or emotional appeals. His very calmness was a statement. And slowly, the people around him began to notice. The courtroom, once charged with cold authority, was now reacting to a different kind of power, one that didn't need a title or a bench to command attention. The court officers, who had maintained strict professionalism throughout the proceedings, now glanced toward him with something like curiosity, even respect, not for what he had done or not done, but for how he stood in the aftermath. As if somehow the judgment meant less than the man's response to it, as if the real verdict was not what had been written on paper, but what he revealed by refusing to be broken. And that's where the dynamic in the room began to shift. Not through protest or chaos, but through quiet reversal. The authority that had delivered the punishment now seemed less steady. The force behind the ruling seemed more fragile. And the one who was meant to be silenced was now the center of attention, not because he had taken over, but because he had simply endured. That's a different kind of power. The kind that doesn't try to overpower others, but draws its strength from conviction. It can't be bought, bullied, or buried. And once it shows up in a room, it changes everything. People feel it. They remember it. And in this case, it revealed something no amount of legal pressure could conceal. The strength of someone who knows exactly who they are and refuses to let anyone else define them. Even the spectators, many of whom had entered with fixed opinions, started to reconsider. The murmurs weren't about guilt or innocence anymore. They were about courage, about how rare it is to see someone stand alone, stripped of protection, stripped of support, and still radiate something unshakable. That kind of composure doesn't come from ego. It comes from knowing that truth has a longer lifespan than power. And it was clear, from the judge to the jury, to the distant observers, that something had slipped out of their control. The fine was a number, a punishment, an attempt to make a point. But the response turned that point inside out. What was meant to end a story became the beginning of something else, something harder to suppress, because it was invisible to the tools of punishment. You can freeze assets, you can strip titles, but you can't make a person flinch when their soul is anchored to something deeper than fear. It didn't end in chaos. It ended in stillness. And in that stillness, something settled over the room. A recognition that the judgment, however severe, had failed to do the one thing it was designed to do: break resolve. The silence wasn't surrender. It was clarity. And it spread slowly to everyone who had come expecting the usual display of dominance. What they witnessed instead was quiet defiance, cloaked in dignity, unshaken by power. And as the final echoes of that day lingered in the air, something undeniable remained behind. Something no legal document could erase and no ruling could overshadow. The courtroom had witnessed a spectacle far more profound than a legal battle. It had witnessed the triumph of inner strength over institutional force. There was no grand applause, no cinematic ending, just the haunting stillness of a room that had seen power misfire and integrity hold its ground. What began as a carefully orchestrated display of authority transformed into an unspoken confession of doubt. The person on the bench, once the unquestionable symbol of the system, had unraveled. Not because he had been argued with, but because he had been met with an unmovable calm. He saw something in front of him that law books couldn't prepare him for. Truth that didn't plead for validation, courage that didn't need a platform, and it broke something inside him. Meanwhile, the one meant to be silenced became the mirror, a silent reflection of what happens when justice forgets its humanity. Without protest, without spectacle, he stood as a reminder that not all battles are fought with noise. Some of the most powerful wars are waged in silence, and some of the most unshakable victories are won with dignity. The room, heavy with judgment, only moments before, now carried something else: respect. People who had come expecting a dramatic takedown left with a different kind of memory. Not of a man defeated, but of a system exposed. And what lingered wasn't the size of the fine or the severity of the ruling. It was the image of composure that couldn't be bought, broken, or bullied. That image, quiet but unforgettable, would replay in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. Even the media struggled to capture the truth. Headlines could report numbers, cameras could freeze faces, but none could explain the quiet reversal of power that took place that day. They could quote the judgment, but not the soul that stood against it without saying a word too many. They could capture the tears of a judge, but not the moment his conscience overtook his authority. And so, the story didn't end with a gavel. It didn't end with a press release. It ended with a truth that refused to be buried under a legal headline. A truth that echoed louder than any courtroom declaration, that real power isn't in titles or punishments, it's in the ability to remain whole when the world tries to break you. That day didn't just reveal a decision, it revealed a soul that refused to bow, and a system that, for a brief and sobering moment, had to look in the mirror and question